So today is the 200th anniversary of the death of Keats.
It is indeed, yeah. So I was posting about that. So yeah, it's a double. I mean, today is literally the day. Who died February the 23rd in 1821, the age of 25. And of course, Dante died in 1321 on September the 14th. So it's a big double anniversary. And of course, I consider, we just haven't got time to do it, but I did consider using Keats's sonnet about Paolo and Francesca just to make a link, but I may allude to it. But
good. Well, are we at 1 o'clock?
We are, according to my thing.
We are.
Are we live?
I believe we are live, he said. I'm fairly sure, yes, we are live. So for those of you who are joining us for this Facebook Live event, my name is Martin Dotterweich. I direct the King Institute for Faith and Culture, formerly the Buechner Institute for Faith and Culture, at King University in Bristol, Tennessee. Every year we enjoy hosting a speaker series. This year with COVID, we've been able to do some online events, and we are delighted to bring one of those to you today. The King Institute has been a part of our students' lives and of the lives of Bristol, Tennessee, more generally since 2007. And we're eager to get back to a more normal future. Indeed, we are hoping this fall to bring, among others, Malcolm himself in the flesh to Bristol. We have another virtual event coming up on Dante next week, and it will also include Malcolm, as well as Jennifer Holberg, the director of the Calvin Center for Faith and Writing, and Rod Dreher, normally known as a columnist, but also the author of How Dante Can Save Your Life. And so that event will happen at the same time, 1 p.m. next Tuesday on March the 2nd. Like this event, it will be available afterwards as well, but if you want to participate live and ask a question in the comments section on Facebook, you'll need to be on live for that. Malcolm Guite comes to us from his home in England. He is a man of many, many talents, a rock and roll singer, a poet, a priest, a teacher, and we're delighted to have him here in some of those capacities as they all mix together. Most recently, he was the chaplain of Girton College, Cambridge. He has served in parish ministry as well. He did his PhD at the University of Durham, where he considered the work of T.S. Eliot as it encompassed the sermons of Lancelot Andrewes and John Donne. Today is an auspicious day for the event that we're holding. It is the 200th anniversary of the death of poet John Keats. And I strongly recommend, if you haven't, that you follow Malcolm on Twitter, because there you'll find his beautiful poem about Keats's importance to him as a young man going to Rome for the first time and standing in the room where Keats died on this day 200 years ago. A moving and beautiful poem. I would also encourage you, if you haven't, to go like the King Institute for Faith and Culture page. This way you can get updates on this event, the event to follow next week, and others that are coming up later this spring. Malcolm has some various images. He's going to have to cue me on these. If we have the occasional technical hiccup, please bear with us and be patient. And if you do have questions along the way, I would encourage you to type those in the comments section. At the end, we'll have some time for question and answer. We're delighted that you're here with us this week, delighted that you can be part of this event, and we hope that it will be a wonderful way for all of us to remember and also to dive back into the works of Dante Alighieri. So I'm going to hand it off to Malcolm.
Okay, well, thank you, Martin, for that kind introduction, and hello to everybody who's watching this on the Facebook Live. It's great to be with you, even if only virtually, and I look forward to the day post-COVID when we can be bodily together. Now, the title I gave for this talk with you was "Never Out of Date: Dante's Contemporary Friend and Companion." And I did that partly because we're being driven by dates to some degree. This is a big Dante year. Dante, he was born, as you know, in about 1265 and died in 1321 on September the 14th. So it's 700 years this year since the death of Dante. He sets his poem, which he tells us begins in the middle of his own life, nel mestro di camino di nostra vita, in the middle of the way of his life, he actually locates the poem date-wise over the Good Friday, Holy Saturday, and Easter of 1300, the turn of the century, the middle of his life. And so in that sense, we can think about dates, and you can read lots of editions of Dante where you can have just acreages of footnotes about the weird internecine politics of Florentine history and all of that. And there's a place for that. But my contention is, as I said in my title, that Dante is never out of date. I want us to think about Dante as our contemporary. I want us to think about him as our companion and guide, somebody who speaks directly into our condition, somebody who, although he's separated by the 700-year gap that we're celebrating as we, Dante 700, is in a sense walking beside us now. And of course, Dante himself models that for us. The idea that a poet from a completely different age, writing in a different language, could actually walk right up to you in the middle of your life and go, hey, you need to hear this, and actually get talking with you and end up guiding you personally on a harrowing journey that's going to finally do you some good. Dante models that supremely because, of course, at the outset of the Commedia, which Dante, I hasten to add, writes in Italian and not in Latin. That itself is a radical thing. And it's a thing to do with, if you like, you know, to use a modern term, street cred, street argot. It's Dante who can write long Latin discourses like the Convivio till the cows come home and be up there with the academics and, you know, riff on Thomas Aquinas, decides that he wants to tell this all-compelling, all-encompassing, all-transformative story in the language that ordinary people speak. Now, it takes us a while to get that because, of course, we don't speak medieval Italian, so we have a translation or more than one translation is the best way to go, and a glance at the original text. And we have to have footnotes because there's stuff in the 13th century or the 14th century we don't get. But the person reading Dante at the time didn't need the footnotes, and they just thought, wow, this person is talking my language and talking to me directly. But as I say, Dante models the idea that a poet, however distant, could actually be your contemporary, because as you know, at the beginning of that poem, Dante has screwed up in his life. He's lost. He says, nel mestro di camino di nostra vita mi ritrova che una selva oscura. In the middle of the way of this life, I found myself lost. That's great. I found myself lost. Me retrovai. Yeah. Anyway, I found myself lost in a dark wood. I'd completely lost the path. He's totally gone astray. And to make it worse, he's being pursued by these three beasts, a leopard, a lion, and a wolf. And he can see this beautiful citadel shining on a hill. He knows that's where he should get to, but he can't get there because these three creatures, which are actually shadows of his own self and his own sin, are kind of herding him off, and he's afraid to go into the woods, or he's lost the path anyway. And then he sees this figure in the distance, and he comes up to him, and it's, you know, it's the point at which if Dante had lived in our age, he would have just been longing to take a selfie, because it turns out that the person he's coming towards and who's coming towards him, a man of Mantua, is his all-time personal favorite poet, the great poet Virgil. And Virgil has come to sort Dante out, to make him realize he can't get directly to the city, and he's got to deal with these shadow beasts, this leopard, lion, and wolf, and he's got to make a different journey, a longer journey, a more difficult journey. As John of the Cross, then quoted by Eliot much later, would say it, the way down is the way up. Dante is going to have to turn around, face his sin, face his difficulty, take that dark spiraling journey through the vicious circles of hell, but not finish there. Turn around, get up, get moving. And to make things even more amazing, not only has Virgil, Dante's favorite poet, there's a wonderful fanboy moment in this thing where Virgil says, I'm Virgil, I'm the guy that wrote about Anchises' son, you know, that's to say Aeneas. And Dante starts going, oh my goodness, I can't tell you how much you mean to me. He wants to go on about how great Virgil. And then Virgil going, I think we have more important business to deal with, like sorting your messy life out, which is exactly what poets do for you. So suddenly, this ancient poet, this classical poet, let it be said, this pre-Christian and pagan poet, although because Virgil's fourth eclogue seemed so much to foreshadow the coming of Christ, Christians had already begun to feel that there was something God breathed in a curious way about Virgil, that Virgil will guide Dante. But it gets even better. When Dante is trying to figure out how he had such incredible good luck in this crisis moment, literally, this is a poem of midlife crisis, Nel mestro di camino de nostra vita. Like, how did this poet come in and sort my life out? Was it just chance? No. It turns out, and this is just like the best bit, that the utter love of Dante's life, Beatrice, the woman through whom as a young man, he'd had a kind of glimpse of the glory of God shining out of a human face. She'd almost been a kind of alter Christus to him. He tells all that story in his beautiful book, The Vita Nuova. And she died tragically young. And you know, he discovers that this Florentine girl, this glorious woman, this, as it turns out, and this is another radical thing about Dante, this great theologian, Beatrice, has looked down from heaven and has seen the mess that Dante is making his life, and has thought, like, I've got to get my man back on the right path. How do I do that? Like, well, I could send him a load of preachers, but God's already sent him a load of preachers. Doesn't seem to have done much good, you know. He's got the Bible, he's got the pulpit, but he's still screwing up. I know what's going to touch this guy. Poetry. I'm going to send him a poet. And this poet is going to eventually put him back on the right path. And that's exactly what happens. And the extraordinary journey that happens down, down, down the spirals of hell, up the wonderful virtuous spirals rather than vicious circles, the positive shape of the Purgatorio, he gets back to where he always should have been, where we always should have been, back to the earthly paradise, back to where we were before we fell. And then Virgil's job is done. Virgil in the allegory also represents kind of reason and logic and all the human faculties. They can take you so far, but no further. You need grace. Beatrice represents grace. And of course, he dances through the fire, he goes into the earthly garden, and there's Beatrice, and there's this wonderful moment of meeting, which is not in the least sentimental, because Beatrice is like a serious, fiery, flaming Italian woman, and she gives him a tongue lashing not to be forgotten. She really sorts him out. But then, of course, she's all wreathed in smiles, and together they ascend through the heavens, and then turn together to see the beatific vision. So this is an extraordinary journey which is inspired by love. It's his love for Beatrice and his love for the poetry of Virgil, but in the end it's God's love for all of them. God's love working for Dante even through pagan poetry. God's love working through that great passion of his youth. God's love working through the love of Beatrice. And Beatrice, we're told, has spoken to Mary about it, and Mary in her grace has said, you can go. So there's all this great inbreathing of love. And of course, the last line of the entire poem, plot spoiler here, the last line of the entire poem is the love that moves the sun and the other stars. And it's love that motivates all things in this poem, which is a paradox, because when we deal with hell, we deal with difficult things. So Virgil is a companion to Dante. And the first thing I want to say, before we just do a quick sort of overview of the poem, and I share with you some poetry of my own that I think might at least express what it was like for this reader to make the journey that I hope you have all either made or will make many times, your own pilgrimage with Dante. I want to say that just as Virgil was an unexpected and entirely contemporary companion to Dante, so though Virgil occasionally quotes his own poems in Latin, he speaks to Dante in contemporary and even idiomatic Italian. So, thanks to many great translations, Dante, I believe, can be personally to us what Virgil was to Dante. It's a similar gap in time, a slightly longer gap between Dante and Virgil than it is between us and Dante. Dante models for us the idea that a poet from another age might have really telling things to say to us. And I think the best way to read the Commedia is to, as it were, let Dante and Virgil walk with us, not just through the poem as they do, talking to each other, but actually through our lives, through what's happening with us, because the poem is really not about the future. It's about the present. It's about who we are. Now, just to give you some idea and an overview of the whole poem, I'd like to look at a painting now, which was done in the 15th century, so just in the kind of generation or two after Dante. It's by Domenico di Michelino. Domenico di Michelino, here it is. And it's called Dante e il suo poema, Dante and his poem. And it was commissioned and painted in the Michelino flourished from 1417 to 1491. So he's a couple of generations down from Dante. And this painting is on the north well of the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore in Florence. And the painting itself is a kind of act of penitence, because as is well known, Florence, in all their internecine squabbling and the terrible kind of bitter civil wars that went on between the so-called black and white Ghibelline and Guelph parties and all the kind of feuding, between families really, that went on. Somebody ended up thinking Dante was on the wrong side, and while he was on a mission to Rome, they exiled him, and on pain that if he returned to the city, he would be burned alive. Then, of course, while he was away, he wrote possibly the greatest poem, certainly in Christendom, one of the greatest poems in the world. And a little while later, the Florentines realized they'd made a bit of a mistake. Dante ended up as an exile in Ravenna. And Dante, of course, Florence, of course, have been going, yay, Dante, ever since. And the Casa di Dante in Florence is a great place. But they were honest enough when a couple of generations later, they made this superb painting of Dante in his poem to place Dante, as you can see him here, outside the city walls of Florence. And you can't see the detail here, but he's holding open a book, and on the book are the words "Nel mezzo di cammino di nostra vita," in the middle of the way of this life. And the painting shows Dante holding the poem, and it shows Florence. You can see it, in my view, on the right-hand side of the painting as we're looking at it. You can see the outer walls of Florence. But the painting also shows in beautiful visual imagery the essential ideas or motifs of the three parts of the Commedia. Dante just called it the Commedia, the comedy. Boccaccio, afterwards another uber Dante fan and a great writer himself, began to refer to it as La Divina Commedia, the Divine Comedy, and that's what Da Vinci came to be called. Just on the left of the picture, you can see it's almost like a cutaway. It's like there's a city wall, and it's almost like there's a cutaway behind it. And behind it, you can see the devil and all the damned souls, or the devils, not the actual devil, he's right down in the pit of hell, but various demons driving souls down. You can see the beginning of a curve or a spiral down and inwards, and they're being led by this awful flag there. But notice something. Do you see how the battlements of the city of hell over there on our left, on Dante's right, the way those little turrets are configured, exactly echo the configuration of the turrets on the walls of Florence? it's like the painting is saying, look, Florence is just the outward and visible sign, but you want to know spiritually what's going on. Look at the cutaway there on the left. And that again is an act of penitence, but it also reveals something about the very nature of the poem. And this is something where we have to get ourselves like really clear at the outset. Dante makes it clear that his poem is an allegory. Indeed, he, fortunately for us, he wrote a letter to the aristocrat who was helping to look after him in Ravenna, a guy called Can Grande, the Epistle to Can Grande, in which he sets out what the allegory is and how allegory itself works. So in an allegory, you tell a story, and the story itself has got to be good. The literal level of the story has got to be great and compelling and full of interest. But the point about the allegory is that it means more than one thing. It appears to be about one thing, but it's actually about something else. And part of the pleasure for the reader is dropping down to that allegorical level and seeing the other stuff that it's about. So on a literal level, the story is about the journey or pilgrimage of the soul through the three realms of the afterlife. And Dante is enabled to do this even while he's still alive, and he has a real body and is still alive. But everybody else in the story are people who've died and are either in Inferno, hell, or Purgatorio, the mountain of purgatory, or Paradiso. And Dante eventually visits all three realms, and that's the story. It's the story of a journey down and up, and then into a final elevation, and at the end, an extraordinary moment of beatific vision. And in that sense, it appears to tell a story about people's afterlives, about what will happen to us in the future. That's the literal, or may not happen, depending on the choices we make in this life. But that's the literal level of the poem. But that's not the main thing that Dante is concerned about. At the allegorical level, what Dante is showing us, and this painting shows it perfectly with the mirror images of, on the one hand, the city of Florence, and on the other hand, the city of Dis, the dark city in hell. The parallel between and the cutaway with the demons shows you that what he's really revealing, what this whole poem about, what it lays out, is not actually a trajectory for the future, because that future hasn't happened yet. And part of the point of the poem is to make sure that it happens in a good way and not a bad way. What it really shows you is a map or diagram of the soul. Every one of the places that you visit with Dante and Virgil, and then later in the final book in the Paradiso with Dante and Beatrice, every one of these places, levels, areas that you visit is a potential or an actuality in your own soul. It's a map of who you are or who you could become, for worse or for better. And that's why there's extraordinary moments where when you first read the Inferno, you think, like, just don't gross me out, Dante. I don't really need to read a lot about tortures, but tortures is not the point. The point there is that the fate of the sinners is really an allegorical, outward, invisible emblem of what that sin is actually like, what it really does to you as a person and does to other people if you strip away the glamour. And we'll give some examples of that in a minute. There we've got the cutaway of hell, and then behind Dante, sort of just centered to the left in the picture, is Mount Purgatory, which you can see has lots of little terraces and different people going around it. It's got an angel who admits you into the upper terraces just there in the middle. And if you follow the spirals up and up and up, can you just see right at the top, there's a red circle. That's a circle of fire. We'll talk about that later. And then there's a garden. And right in the center of the garden is Adam and Eve. That's where we all came from. You know, back in the day, I'm gonna, date myself now, when Joni Mitchell wrote the song Woodstock, she was said, in that poem, we are stardust, we are golden, We are caught in the devil's bargain, and we've got to get ourselves back to the garden. Well, Inferno and Purgatorio, the final end of Purgatorio, is getting back to the garden. But I have to say, I think Dante, much as I admire Joni Mitchell, Dante does a slightly better job than Joni here, in that, if you remember, Joni's song seemed to think that you just like another spliff and you'd be in paradise. You know, do you remember she says, I dreamed I saw the bomber jet planes riding shotgun in the sky, turning into butterflies above our nation, as though you could just do it like that. Well, we found out you can't just do it like that. You have to purge what's dark within you before you can even consider criticizing or purging it in anyone else. And that's what this poem is about. We will get back to the garden, but we'll only get back to the garden by dancing through the fire. It's just exactly what happens at the end of the Purgatorio. So there's the Purgatorio, and you get to the top. And then beyond that, you can see these beautiful, delicately painted spheres, which with their circling planets, and inside those are the great celestial intelligences of the angels that move the heavens. And eventually, when he's reunited with Beatrice in the garden of the earthly paradise, that's Eden at the top there. But we're meant for more than Eden. It's not just get back to the garden. And here again, we have to say to Joni, hey, you need another song. Because God didn't just intend us for the full glory of our restored humanity, but actually wants us to be with him in heaven forever, wants to raise us up. We've been made like Christ and with Christ, a little lower than the angels, but that we might be exalted in glory. And that's what happens in the final book, the Paradiso. So, but all of that is not just a speculation about the future. Just as there are hellish places in your soul and you'll recognize them, so there are places where that hellishness can be dealt with and sorted out and purged and turned positive. You'll recognize those in the Purgatorio. So already patterned in your soul, because you are made in the image of God, who is not only is in heaven, but is heaven. So in you are all the full potentialities of the glories of heaven. And there's an echo of that in you too. And you'll make that journey as well as you read through the whole Commedia. So, you know, this is just a little warm-up act to show you how good the poem is. It's the poem itself you want to look at. Now, let's see if we can zoom in now on some details. So let's, we're going to start with the Inferno. So I think if we scroll down, we should come to a diagram which I have borrowed from Dorothy Sayers' beautiful Penguin Classics edition of the Commedia from the Inferno volume. And hell, as you will see, is like a steep pit. And in the narrative, in the literal narrative, we hear the story of how it was created. When Lucifer fell from heaven to earth, the idea is that he plunged down with such ruin and combustion that he created a sort of crater. He fell right down into the center of the earth where he got stuck. And he's sort of like a plug, like the rotten, you know, the worm in the core of a rotten apple. Let's go down. And there he is with his wings and his three faces, absolutely stuck in the frozen ice, which is another brilliant idea of Dante, that hell does in fact freeze over. And when you get to the really awful sins of personal betrayal and treason and the unsaying and undoing of all those webs of warmth and love that hold us together in trust and communication, when those are severed, things freeze. Anyway, so there we go all the way down. Now, if we just can scroll back up a little bit first. Hell is actually divided in this story into kind of three regions. And these regions represent different aspects of sin. Now, you may remember I mentioned that Dante was being chased by three sort of shadow beasts, a leopard, a lion, and a wolf. Well, they're actually a foreshadowing of the kind of gradual deepening and darkening and degradation of those sins, which are all refusals or failings of love in us, of true love, that eventually corrode the soul if we allow it to happen. And in upper hell here, you see, she's written incontinence. There's the sins that are, all sin is a corruption of good. Dante got this from Augustine, that God made everything good. So a thing has to be good before it can be bad. You know, if I say that's a bad refrigerator, I mean, it's because it doesn't keep my beer cold. You know, I have to know what a refrigerator is good for before I can call it bad. And that's why, in the end, Lucifer, who becomes the devil, is the worst of all creatures, because he was originally the best. As Shakespeare says, lilies that fester smell far worse than weeds. So he starts with, if you like, they're the lesser sins, and they're the corruptions of the warmth and natural things in us. So it's good to enjoy God's good gifts, and enjoy food and drink, but then you can become gluttonous, and you can make those things your God. God made us for love and to love one another, and for the delights of the expression of erotic love in the union of marriage, but those things can also be corrupted and destroyed. So there's the lustful, the gluttonous, the hoarders and spendthrifts, the wrathful, but those are, if you like, you can do some damage with those things, but they're not, they haven't turned the core of your soul. They're like a slight twisting of a thing that was, you know, pretty good to begin with. But then you get down in the next section of hell to violence. You get violence towards self, which is the wood of the suicides and the abominable sands. And then you get, if we go down again, let's descend a little bit more. The violence is the sins of the lion. We have the leopard, which is the sort of sensual sins. The lion is the sins to do with anger and violence, but it gets worse. You descend even further into nether hell here, and you have fraudulence and treachery, and these are the sins of the wolf. These are the cold, calculating, utterly ruthless, selfish sins that say, as long as I'm in power, I don't care who suffers. You know, it's the sin of Herod saying, if I have to slay the little children to stay in power, then let it be so. But ultimately also it's the sins of the betrayers, of Judas and of others who saw the good, knew the good, were loved by the good, and then chose to destroy and betray those bonds, and to betray the good. And of course, in the very act of betraying the good in others, they were betraying and destroying the good in themselves. They were losing what Dante calls il ben d'intelletto, the good of the intellect, the good of the will. They were calling good bad and bad good, and they were then unable to distinguish between them. So eventually, as they make their way down, Dante and Virgil, they come to the nethermost pit of hell, and it gets colder and colder, and there's a vast sea of ice. And then there's Satan himself, stuck in the middle, and we'll say more about that. He's actually immobile, and there are vast distances between him and everyone, and he's creating this freezing wind in hell by sort of fanning his wings. And if you look at the diagram, you'll see that the pit of hell is getting narrower and narrower. Sin often presents itself to us as a freedom, a largesse, a looseness. That's what the sins of incontinence all tell us they are. But actually, as we get down, we have less and less freedom. We become like the addict who's just become completely fixed upon and therefore transfixed by the single thing. But it's not the end of the story. A lot of people trying to read Dante and get no further than the Inferno, which is a great mistake. So I mentioned to you the idea that the sins of the punishments of the sins, in fact, in the literal story, they're punishments, but in the allegory, they're actually very, very useful sort of mind pictures or soul pictures to help us in the act of spiritual discernment. So we don't have time, unfortunately, to go through all of them. And we could spend, I used to run a Dante reading group where we did a whole term on the Inferno, and then a whole term on the Purgatorio, and then a whole term on the Paradiso, and we matched it against the Cambridge terms. So it was great. My students got to brag, hey, I'm going through hell with Dr. Guite this term, you know, and I think January is going to be pretty purgatorial, but summer's going to be paradise. It'll be great. So just to give you one example, because we can't give more, well, perhaps let's pick one of the most famous moments in the Inferno, which is, if we go back up again for a second, Martin, we won't deal with the really dark things down here. Let's go up to the upper reaches of hell, where the slope's not quite so bad. That's great. You'll see, actually, after they've got out of limbo, the first, because it's actually the least of the sins. It's in the list of the 7 deadly sins. It's actually the last one, not the first one. It's not like pride. Anyway, this is where the lustful are dealt with, and the quote unquote punishment is that they're blown around in a circle. They go round and round in circles, and there's this wind, but the wind isn't like a clear wind. I mean, in fact, the light is dark. Dante says luce mute. The light was mute. It wasn't telling me anything, and it's smoke. And there's this vast circle of blowing smoke, and there's all these famous lovers who had committed adultery or had broken up marriages or relationships, you know, and they're being whirled around and round. And as Dante notices them, he suddenly realizes, oh my goodness, that's my great aunt Francesca, because he was related to Francesca. He sees Paolo and Francesca, and somehow or other, in spite of the wind blowing them around, they sort of come close enough, and he gets to hear their story. And it was all about, you know, she was in an arranged marriage, wasn't, you know, they loved each other, but they weren't married to each other. They definitely knew that they shouldn't be doing this. They went into a garden, and interestingly, they read the stories about King Arthur and about Lancelot and Guinevere. So that's cool. The medieval Italians were into our national story. And as Dante, as they rather subtly put it, when they got to the bit where Lancelot and Guinevere consume their passion, it just says they read no more that day. And so this adultery takes place, which has all kinds of destructive consequences. Dante is so moved by the story, maybe because this is an issue for him as well, he actually faints. And then they're just still trying to tell the story when they get blown away. Now, why is the punishment of this so-called punishment, but really an emblem of what it is, these people who can't get a single footing, who can't actually control what they're doing, who are just picked up by a wind and carried, and are at the same time blinded by smoke? Well, you talk to people who've fallen into this particular sin, and you're bound to hear the phrase, they'll say, look, we didn't really mean to do this, but they'll say it, won't they? We just got carried away. And there's even a modern song now that says, you know, smoke gets in your eyes. I mean, the so-called punishment is actually a picture of what giving into something eventually does to you. At the time, it feels like a brave, romantic, desperate, free choice. But actually, it's a giving into something which diminishes your possibilities of choice. And Dante shows us a picture for a moment of it going on forever. And that's just a quick glimpse. Now, I made the case to you that we should really be journeying not just through the poem, but through our own lives, letting that reflect back. And I've read this poem several times in my life and made a kind of Dantesque retreat every so often where I journey through this. And I decided that I would try and write a sequence of poems using Dante's own terza rima to try and give you, if you like, a kind of a reader's account of what that was. So if we go on, I'm going to read you, just to give you, as another way of touring the Inferno, those poems. And this at least will give you a kind of a glimpse of what it felt like for one reader, and perhaps for some of you as readers to journey with Dante, just as Dante journeyed with Virgil. And my first poem is called In Medias Res, and it's about Dante meeting Virgil. It's about reading that encounter. It's about the sense of lostness, and it's about the need to actually face up to the truth and see the inferno in oneself and get through it so you can get beyond it. So here's my poem, In Medias Res. And so I start again, here in the middle of a life I scarcely know. How many guesses left to get the riddle? The woods are dark and darker shadows grow. I followed someone here but lost her leading, with nothing but my lostness left to show. The voice that drew me on is faint and fading, but something else is creeping up behind, over whose heart I wonder are we treading. My shadow beasts consent, though they are blind. All three are here, the leopard, lion, wolf, my kith and kin, the emblems of my kind. They've come to draw me back across the gulf, back from the path I wanted to have chosen. Fall back, they call. You can't run from yourself. Fall to the place where every hope is frozen. Of course, that's an allusion to the freezing bottom of hell. But not this time. Not this time. This time, I choose the other path of the dead and risen, to try the hidden heart of things, to let go, to lose myself and find again the voice that called and drew me here, my freeing muse. Begin again, she calls. You have the choice. Little by little, you can travel far. Learn to lament before you can rejoice. Sing to the shadows, sing and do not fear, but sing them into love, little by little. Begin the song exactly where you are. And so I start again, here in the middle. And that's about nel nestro di camino di nostra vita, in the middle of the way of this life. And it's about not falling back into despair, the place where every hope is frozen, but choosing instead to brave it and to go through it and to look at it, but accompanied not only by Dante, but also by Christ. So let's go on to the next poem, Through the Gate. Now, there's a famous passage in the Inferno where they come to the actual gate of hell, and famously it says, "Abandon hope, all ye who enter here." And needless to say, Dante's a bit scared. But then he remembers that Virgil wrote the Aeneid, and in the Aeneid, Aeneas, Anchises' son, goes down into the Inferno and is able to come up again. So he thinks, maybe, I'm in good company here. He's going to take me through. But the really significant thing as you begin to walk with Dante and Virgil through the Inferno is every time, so often they come to like a gate that's just been blown right open, or a castle that's fallen down in ruins. And the devils are always trying to say, oh, nothing to see here, move swiftly on, there's nothing going on. But gradually they realize somebody's been in front of them. Somebody has been this way and has blown the whole place open, has gone right down through it against the devil's will. And of course, that person is Christ. Christ has harrowed hell. Christ descended into hell. Christ went down there to find Adam and Eve and the patriarchs and everybody and to bring them out. That's why those great Orthodox icons of the resurrection show Jesus not rising alone, but holding Adam and Eve by the hand. And the devils are very embarrassed by the fact that, in fact, Christ has busted hell open. But gradually, Dante and Virgil realize, there's a way through here because Christ has found it. And that's very much where my poem is coming from. My poem is saying, if Christ harrows hell, then let him harrow your hell. Don't keep anything back from him. Just let him see the whole thing, and he will take you through it. And this is very much rooted in the idea that hell is a map of the soul. Dante's Inferno is a map of the soul. So this is my poem, Through the Gate. Begin the song exactly where you are, for where you are contains where you have been and holds the vision of your final sphere. And do not fear the memory of sin. There is a light that heals, and where it falls, transfigures and redeems the darkest stain into translucent color. Loose the veils and draw the curtains back. Unbar the doors of that dread threshold where your spirit fails, the hopeless gate that holds in all the fears that haunt your shadowed city. Fling it wide and open to the light that finds and fares through the dark pathways where you run and hide, through all the alleys of your riddled heart, as pierced and open as his wounded side. Open the map to him, and make a start. And down the dizzy spirals through the dark, his light will go before you. Let him chart and name and heal. Expose the hidden ache to him. The stinging fires and smokes that blind your judgment carry you away. The murk and muted gloom in which you cannot find the love that you want, the love that you once thought worth dying for. Call him to all you cannot call to mind. He comes to harrow hell. And now, to your well-guarded fortress, let his love descend. The icy ego at your frozen core can hear his call at last. Will you respond? So you see that, if you remember that diagram, I've identified that figure of Satan frozen at the core with that frozen ego, the icy ego at your frozen core. That's what's got to hear Christ. That's what's got to be converted. It mustn't stay stuck in the ice. It's got to learn to move and live and love. Now, I'm conscious that our time is running away with us. So I think I'm going to, since I've taken us down to the pit of hell, I think we're going to move through the next poem. I won't read you the Vexilla Rageous poem. It's in my book, The Singing Bowl, and you can look at it yourself. That's about gradually climbing back up out. Now yes, here we are. Let's go on to the next diagram. Just before we do that. You remember the diagram with Satan stuck in the middle of the earth, frozen. Now, here's a really cool thing. People will tell you that medieval people thought the world was flat. That's complete nonsense. That's a 19th century invention to try and do down the Middle Ages. The medievals understood perfectly well that the world was round. And in fact, Dante not only understood that the world was round, but he worked out that long before Newton, that since gravity radiates from the center, and if you're standing on the northern hemisphere, down is that way. But obviously, if you were standing on the southern hemisphere, and he recognized there must be a southern hemisphere, that nobody had ever visited it, then down would be the other way, that, you know, you fall in the tube. So that becomes allegorically just the most brilliant thing. When they finally get down to the figure of Satan right at the core, Dante and Virgil don't stop. That's the point. They keep going. And they find a way of climbing right through the center of the earth and down past Satan's midriff. And as it turns out, up his hairy legs. Because as soon as they actually start climbing up, they realize that, in fact, Satan is stuck in the world upside down and waving his stupid, silly little legs. And they climb and climb and climb, and they get to the earth's surface. And then they come here. They come to this Mount of Purgatory. They find themselves on this island in the southern hemisphere in the Antipodes. And here it is. Now you see it's called Mount Purgatory, and you can see it's going up and up and up. Let's go up it again, Martin. Let's just scroll it so we can ascend it. All these different cornices, they're all represent. Now we'll just pause there. So do you remember that hell was the narrow, narrow, narrow pit going down? Do you see that, in fact, Mount Purgatory is the positive shape made out of the negative shape of the cone? The pit of hell has now become the conical mountain. And Dante says that when, in the literal story, that when Satan fell, he displaced all this massive amount of material as he fell crashing down and then got stuck in the center of the earth. And it was all forced down through the earth and came out as this mountain. So all the displaced material, the positive stuff that's been left to make the negative, vicious circles of hell, where you go nowhere and end up frozen in the middle, is now this mountain. And if hell consists of vicious circles, then purgatory consists of virtuous spirals. Now, in purgatory, sin is also dealt with, and there is suffering as there is in hell. But this, with this immense difference, that this time the suffering is to some purpose. It is purgative. This time, people are allowing what happens to them, including even the bad stuff and including their own faults and foibles. They're putting them into the hands of Jesus, and they're being used to make them better, used to refine them, used to help them. And again, it's based around the 7 deadly sins, except that the 7 deadly sins are dealt with in the order of the worst first and the least last. And the worst is pride. So the proud are crawling around there with these kind of great weights on them. And then there's the envious, and then there's the wrathful and the slothful and the covetous. You can see it going up, the gluttonous. But in each case, something good is being done about it. In each case, there's a chance to change. And why is there this massive difference between the vicious circles of the Inferno and the virtuous spirals of the Purgatorio? I'll tell you why. Because people have repented. Because they've seen the hell inside themselves and said, I don't want to buy into that. I don't want to live with that. I want to change. And they've come to Christ, and they are in one sense already redeemed. They don't have to do anything to earn, Dante has a full doctrine of grace. You don't have to do stuff to earn salvation. Christ has earned that for you, just like he harrowed hell. But you don't want to stagger into heaven clarted up with all the horror and misery and sin and screwed upness of yourself. You want to get yourself sorted out and ready to enjoy the delights of heaven. And Dante sees sin as essentially disordered love. And Mount Purgatory is the place where love itself is reordered. And it's done in the most astonishing way. And it's also a place full of art and liturgy. I mean, they're singing the Psalms all the time. And every time a soul finally makes it back to the earthly garden and ready to ascend into paradise, the whole mountain shakes and tremors with joy, and people sing Psalms. When Israel came out of Egypt, when Israel was redeemed from slavery, and they all rejoice with each other. In hell, everybody is against everybody else. Nobody's actually on anybody else's side except their own. Whereas in the Purgatorio, even though they're all suffering, and some of them have been really notorious sinners, they're all trying to help each other out. They're kind of in therapy, if you like. They're really trying to, they are, as we would say, a recovery community. And it's an astonishing and really beautiful part of the Commedia. In fact, I will say now, I think the Purgatorio is my favorite of the books, because if you think of the Inferno as the pessimistic version of the way we live now, warts and all, the Purgatorio is the optimistic version of the way we live now. And that's expressed in the actual geography of it, that it is this positive ascending shape made out of the reverse of the negative pit of hell. Now, one of the beautiful things about the Purgatorio is the kind of liturgical call and response that's going on all the time. And as everybody goes round the virtuous spirals and gradually works their way up, there's an angel. When they first get in, there's an angel who inscribes 7 letters on their forehead. The letter P, which is for peccatore, is for sin. And these are the outward and visible reminders of the different sins that they've committed, the 7 deadly sins. But as they work each one of those off, as it were, an angel comes round the other way with a feather and just brushes their brows, and the letter disappears. It's all about being cleansed. I thought I'd give you a little glimpse of how that liturgy works. So if we go on to the next slide, if we go on to the next thing, here we are, Purgatorio, a liturgy. This shows you the organization of the Purgatorio. And I once did the whole of the poem takes place over the Easter weekend. And so like all that stuff I said about harrowing hell in Inferno takes place on Holy Saturday when Christ descended into hell. So I once did a retreat for my church called Towards Easter with Dante. And I literally took the verses and the bits out of the Purgatorio and made a liturgy, and we moved around in circles, and people came one way and said their thing, just like the souls, and I went the other way, and as a priest absolved them. So what happens? The first terrace, pride. What is the antidote to pride? Guess what? It's really simple. It's the Lord's Prayer. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, not my name. Pride wants to hallow your own name. Thy kingdom come, not my kingdom. Thy will be done on earth, not mine. Thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory. That's what the proud need to learn. So the proud go round and round saying the Lord's Prayer, and along comes the angel with a feather and says, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Guess what? One of the Beatitudes. And in a moment of liturgical genius, Dante uses the Beatitudes as the antidote to the 7 deadly sins. So the terrace of the envious. So that's where you wish you were as good as somebody else, and you resent them for being better. They say, Mary, Michael, Peter, and all the saints pray for us. Instead of being jealous of other people who've done more in this piety stakes than I have, I just say, help me out. And what's the opposite of envy? It's actually not just like not being jealous. It's not a negative thing. It's a positive thing. It's about being merciful, about not judging people, about just spreading grace. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Then we deal with the sin of wrath and anger. They say, Lamb of God, have mercy on us. Why? Because all the wrath is dealt with by the Lamb. And what is the Beatitude? Which is the antidote and blessing and release for the wrathful? Of course, it's blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God. And so it goes on. And we won't have time to go through all of those, but this material will be available to you. I think Martin is going to post it on. So we go through all the sins: wrath, sloth, avarice, gluttony, and finally lust. Let's just pause on lust for a minute, as you do. So they say, the sinners, God of supreme clemency, burn with the right fire our desires, that we may keep watch on our appetites. And of course, blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. So now I've just written some notes to think about what we're going to do through the fire to the earthly paradise. Well, if you remember that picture at the beginning, we needn't go back through the slides. I'll show you. I've got a copy of it here. Do you remember the mountain? Right at the top, there's that little circle of fire before you get into the garden. And one of the most wonderful cantos in the Purgatory is when finally they've dealt with all the other sins. And of course, these are more and more minor, because the smaller circles you get up. But the last one, the thing you finally got to deal with, if you need to learn to love aright, you need to deal with lust. You mustn't be those people who were blown around and got carried away and have smoke in their eyes. You've got to be able to be utterly full-hearted and pure-hearted and clear. Then you can have all the delights of love. And just as there is a burning fire of love, so the fires of lust that have been destructive have to be transmuted. And interestingly, in Dante, as you get closer and closer to the dealing with the lust issue, strangely, there are more and more poets. Like, there are poets everywhere. And in the end, it's just almost like a conga of poets. So Statius and, well, Virgil's there, obviously, and Arnaud and, various Provençal poets. And it's the last thing you've got to get through and deal with before you can really get back to the garden. And Dante can almost not bear to step into the flames, but Virgil says, you've got to go through this dance through the fire. And he, just to encourage him, he says, I think I can see Beatrice's eyes shining on the other side. So that's another thing. You're not dealing with lust as a sin because you don't think that, beautiful love between a man and a woman is a bad thing. It's because you think it's a good thing, that you actually want to get it right. So eventually Dante dares to do it and goes through the fire with Virgil and attains the earthly paradise and meets Beatrice again. Interestingly, lots of other poets have been drawn to this moment, and perhaps most famously T.S. Eliot in Little Gidding, the last and the greatest of the four quartets. The four quartets, as you know, are distributed around earth, air, water, and fire is the Little Gidding quartet. And basically in that poem, Eliot, when he's out fire watching after the raid in the Blitz, meets this figure walking towards him, who is in part Dante. And Dante speaks to him. And Dante says, from wrong to wrong, the exasperated spirit proceeds, unless restored by that refining fire, where you must move in measure like a dancer. He faded on the blowing of a horn, and Eliot realizes, we all need to deal with this and dance through the fire. So we are rapidly running out of time, and I'd love to have some responses from you as well. So we brought Dante and Virgil safely up to the earthly paradise. And there's a wonderful moment. Now that he's rightly ordered his love, he's seen sin for what it is. He's not stayed stuck in the middle of it. He's now been up the mountain of purgatory to reorder and deal with it. And Virgil says a very famous thing to him. He says to Dante, I crown and mitre thee over thyself. A fully integrated human being doesn't need external authorities, the external symbol of secular authority, the crown, the external symbol of religious authority, the mitre. Those things are in us. God has written his law in our hearts. And then, of course, Virgil steps back and disappears. He's done his job. He's law and reason and poetry and the arts, but actually now we need pure grace, the divine love, theology. And for Dante, that's not a doddery old guy like me in a study. That's the amazing, vivacious, brilliant, intellectually acute, utterly glorious Beatrice. And she comes and takes over the story. And in the third and final book of the Commedia, they ascend through the heavens. And we're not going to have time for that. But I would like to just read you the poem that I wrote, just to chime in. It's a bit of a confessional poem in a way, but it says a lot of what I think my journey through Dante's been. And it's the last in my Purgatory series. It's called Dancing Through the Fire. If we just keep scrolling. There we are. That's the one. And I'll finish what I have to say with this. I have a quotation there at the beginning, per te poeta fui, per te Christiano. This is a great moment where someone, Statius, the Christian poet, sees Virgil with Dante. And he doesn't care who Dante is, but man, Virgil. And so he goes up to Virgil as a fanboy, just like Dante did, and goes, oh. So he says to this pagan poet, through who, per te poeta fui, per te Christiano, through you I became a poet, through you I became a Christian. And it's a great tribute to how poetry can be transformative and transfigurative. And I decided that this was the time, my writing my poem of my own, about my own journey through this book of the Purgatorio, to give tribute to the poetic imagination and how that transformed and transfused things for my life, Dante's poetry and many other poets as well. So I'm going to read you this poem, and then we'll perhaps be able to, Martin will be able to open things out and lead us through questions. I'm sorry we only got through 2 of the 3 books, but, ars longa vita brevis. So, Dancing Through the Fire. Then stir my love in idleness to flame, to find at last the free refining fire that guards the hidden garden whence I came. Oh, do not kill, but quicken my desire. Better to spur me on than leave me cold. Not maimed I come to you, I come entire, lit by the loves that warm, the lusts that scold, that you may prove the one, reprove the other, though both have been the strength by which I scaled the steps so far to come where poets gather and sing such songs as love gives them to sing. I thank God for the ones who brought me hither and taught me by example how to bring the slow growth of a poem to fruition and let it be itself a living thing, taught me to trust the gifts of intuition and still to try the tautness of each line, taught me to taste the grace of transformation and trace in dust the face of the divine, taught me the truth as poet and as Christian, that drawing water turns it into wine. Now I am drawn through their imagination to dare to dance with them into the fire, harder than any grand renunciation, to bring to Christ the heart of my desire just as it is, in every imperfection, surrendered to his bright refiner's fire, that love might have its death and resurrection. And in the end, it's death and resurrection, which is at the core of the Commedia. Thank you for listening.
Good. Malcolm, thank you so much. That's wonderful. as the first question, I want to go to one that just came at us, which would maybe not in full form get us toward the Paradiso.
Right.
One comment suggests the Paradiso is the hardest to read. How would you equip us to get into that final stage, and how would you conceive of that as part of the soul's journey, our inward journey
Right.
into the
Thank
Commedia?
you. Yeah. Yeah. Obviously, we just haven't had time for me to deal with the Paradiso material. Though perhaps I can read one or two of the poems as a way of explaining. So I think people do find the Paradiso difficult to read. It's got a lot of theology in it. It's got, he gets to meet all his favorite theologians and debate with them. And, some of that stuff, particularly if you're not into Thomas Aquinas or St. Bonaventure, you need the footnotes, and that's difficult. But you have to see the Paradiso essentially as playful. It's delighting in the intellect. It's delighting in the playfulness. There's a point where he gets all the great philosophical theologians literally to do a circle dance. They're bright lights shining and they kind of circle around each other. And I think you need a good translation and you need some help with notes. I actually think you also need a kind of preface to get you there. I think Dorothy Sayers' own preface in her translation of the Commedia, her preface to the Paradiso is perfect. That will really get you in a good way. I think you need more than her translation. She chose to use rhyming terza rima, which was a brilliant, but as I say, a brave decision, because obviously you can't be as accurate to the Italian if you're trying to rhyme in English, because English just doesn't, you have to work hard in Italian not to rhyme, but English doesn't have quite so many rhymes. I would recommend Robin Kirkpatrick's translation of the Paradiso, which I heard him read actually while it was still in the making, a great Cambridge professor. And in fact, when Penguin Classics, who had published the Dorothy Sayers one, decided they need a new one under the Penguin Classics imprint, it was Robin Kirkpatrick that they got to do it. And I tend to use the two of them together, Dorothy Sayers and Robin Kirkpatrick, to just get a more rounded view.
That's grand. For show and tell, here are the Dorothy Sayers. I don't know
Yeah.
if Penguin keeps them both in print or if
I don't know. I think, hang on, let me just I've got the Robin Kirkpatrick as well. So I've got the Dorothy Sayers too. So for show and tell, here's the Robin Kirkpatrick. You can easily get the Dorothy Sayers, online from maybe books or whatever, and you should get them while they're going, so yeah.
That's grand. Something that was alluded to earlier, and I'm curious if you have any further comments on it. Why is it that so many people stop with Inferno? Why is it that Inferno is the famous book that so many people read and never go farther than that?
Well, partly because it's a really big book and people, literally get stuck and, partway through. Partly because obviously, I've been trying to, all I've been saying to you think about the allegory. This is a picture of you. It's not, I'm countering something, right? I'm countering a view which just looks at the Inferno as punishing other people. And the thing that says, oh, Dante puts all his enemies in hell and all his friends in heaven. And, he's got all these popes he didn't like where he's stuck upside down with their legs waving. And I mean, that view of historicizing it and othering it and saying, it's just about, but that's appealing to some people, I mean, there's a kind of Schadenfreude, isn't it? There's kind of, wanting to see other people suffering. There's some people that say it's very dramatic, the famous Paolo and Francesca thing we talked about. Keats, of course, wrote his day-to-day, wrote a sonnet about that. It's kind of, it's like reading a sort of tabloid newspaper, it's got all the gory bits, and Purgatorio is much more searching. And of course, Paradiso invites you into a kind of delighted contemplation of beauty itself, but it also is intellectually very searching. So I think people now I'll tell you the way to avoid getting stuck. Here you are. Tell you how to avoid getting stuck in hell. Just, we've had a great project going on in Cambridge over the last 4 or 5 years, which I've been partly involved in, which I think is intellectually just one of the most exciting things that I've seen happen in Cambridge, which is saying something. And the project is called the Vertical Dante. And it was thinking about the 3 realms. If you think about the 3 realms as stacked above one another, so there's the pit of hell, there's Mount Purgatory, and there's the Paradiso with the spheres of heaven. this project of reading Dante, there's a thing called the Lecture Dante, reading Dante. Various universities do it across the world, where you read through the whole Commedia. And until the last 4 or 5 years, everybody did it in order, i.e. you go down through hell, then you go up through purgatory, and then, you know, if you're not completely exhausted, you make it to paradise. So some people in Cambridge, I mean, Robin Kirkpatrick and various others had George Sayers, I think, had the genius idea of reading them in parallel, because they've all got the same number of canti in them. They're saying, what would happen if we read this circle of hell and this spiral of purgatory and this sphere of heaven all together? We'll read all the canto number 3s together and all the canto number 9s. And so at the very same time that we're looking at what happened in hell in this vicious circle, we see the corresponding virtuous spiral, and then we see the utterly redeemed and glorious thing. And when you do that, my goodness, the poem opens up. And of course, you're simultaneously reading the Paradiso while you're reading the Inferno. Let me just give you one example of the way that works symbolically. I already mentioned the whirling around of the lustful in the Inferno, and in the dark and in the smoke and in no firm footing, and I got carried away, right? Then, no, I'm deliberately going to go into this fire, this circle of fire that purges me. Well, when you get to really redeemed love, and I mean redeemed erotic love, in one of the circles, of the circle of Venus, of course, which is the, you know, the circle of amorousness and love in heaven, in the sphere of Venus, you get this woman Kunitsa, who, you know, slightly rude sounding name, and she was a famous courtesan, and who repented and gave all her loves to Christ and was very charitable, and whose kind of erotic genius that had been twisted and perverted and become part of the sex industry in Venice or wherever it was she was, utterly liberated. That same grace and warm-hearted, amorous, connected nature gives her this incredible fiery energy, and she whirls around the heaven of Venus, beaming redemptive love on everybody. So, and it's the exact opposite of the darkness and smoke and wind of the same thing in hell. So it actually, those 3 levels, you read them tiered like that. So the Vertical Dante project, you can look it up on the web. There's all the lectures are on the web. We read through the poems together, and I was lucky to be part of the seminars doing that. And then we had a series of distinguished lecturers who picked their favorite set of 3 canti to write about, and it's all on the web, and it's also been published in books, and that's a really fabulous way to read the poem. I'm glad to have a chance to mention that, so thank you for the question.
So it connects to the structure is so central to understanding the poem.
Totally.
It does. I mean, we can read it either in that sort of layered way, or we can read it start to finish. Is this the sort of book that one can dip into little bits of? I'm thinking of the practice of the Sortes Virgilianae, where you let the book fall open and you read from it. Do you think it works at both levels, or do you
I think it could, if you were already familiar with the poem, right? If you had the basic, I mean, I'm sorry I didn't have time, but we would have needed 2 hours for me to have gone through, you know. But if you were basically familiar with the, I mean, in this case, the geographical, if you like, the visual structure of the poem is also its intellectual structure. Like the positive shape, negative shape tells you everything you need to know about Inferno and Purgatory, you know, all of that. If you had basically had a map of it in your mind, then you could do Sortes Virgilia. You could just open up and read a good bit and enjoy it, you know. But I think there's something to be said for the steady reading, and I think the way to do it is in groups. I mean, the thing we used to do when I had the Dante reading group was to basically, we'd say, we'll take a whole term, which in Cambridge is about 8 weeks, and we'll divide the Inferno up, and we'll go away and privately read. It only meant reading, you know, 3 or 4 cantos a week, if that. It wasn't. And we'll make notes and think, what's the question? What do we like? Where am I in this? You know, maybe I won't tell the group about that, whatever it is. And then we would come and discuss it, and then we come away and do the next one. And we read the book over a year, or over 3 academic terms. But this was, I have to admit, say this was a fun group. This wasn't an examined group. This was like we call them the Federation small groups, where the little different theological colleges were mixing their traditions and people could meet each other. And you can just make a reading group and do it that way. I think that's a really great way. When you've done that, then yeah, you can just zoom in and you can go to certain, I go to certain places, you know, when I need to go to them. I mean, you know, there's a wonderful bit towards the end of the Purgatory where he kind of has a dream that allows him, and St. Lucy comes in the form of an eagle and lifts him like in the dream in advance to where he's finally going to get to, and gives him the vision that he needs to keep going. And I kind of go to that quite a lot when I'm feeling, you know, I mean, this long bloody lockdown, this just, you know, I can't keep going. I think about that moment where Dante is lifted on wings and shown what he's going to see as really helpful. So I go to it for that moment. I don't read everything up to it because I know where it is and what it's about.
To shift gears just slightly, since it is the Keats anniversary today, and of course Keats wrote, as you suggest, that that poem about Paolo and Francesca. Why is it, as you and I conversed about this yesterday, there's this long train of English language poetry, English,
Yeah.
Scottish, Irish, Welsh, that is based in the Divine Comedy, which seems to me rather surprising. Here's a poem that is Mediterranean and very Catholic. And
yeah, it's
effect.
I mean, and when we say long, we really mean long. I mean, Chaucer translates Dante and writes about it. He calls him Dant, interestingly. Dante, you know, is important for the late medievals in England, and Milton, you know, reads Dante, and then there's a huge revival of Dante in the 19th century. My own poem on reading the Commedia, I preface a comment from William Gladstone, the great British Prime Minister, who was also a superb literary scholar. He writes this: the reading of Dante is not merely a pleasure, a tour de force, or a lesson. It is a vigorous discipline for the heart, the intellect, the whole man. But the poets were particularly into Dante. So Keats, we've already mentioned, Shelley, and Shelley wrote poems. He wrote The Triumph of Life, In Terza Rima. You know, Shelley could speak fluent Italian and was reading Dante in Italian, and just simply as a poet. I think for me, though, personally, the really interesting afterlife of Dante in the English poetic tradition, or the English literary tradition more widely, is actually in the 20th century. And I would say three of the key figures there are Samuel Beckett, T.S. Eliot, and Seamus Heaney. Beckett, I mean, Beckett's early short stories, you know, more pricks than kicks. There's a story in there called Dante and the Lobster, which is about his character Belacqua, the student in Dublin, working on a translation of Dante while his Dante teacher, with whom he has a kind of thwarted kind of desire, is cooking a lobster for him. And it's kind of really weird, but it's actually very powerful. And the name Belacqua tells you everything you need to know, because Belacqua is a character in the Purgatorio who is a musician and who kept putting off his salvation and like not dealing with it. And Dante knew him, and like he was not only a musician, he was a lute maker, and like he was just like the classic kind of muso on the road. So like he would work incredibly hard on the new album, or in this case the new lute. Like he would get all this all the money from it and then just like blow it on parties and do nothing until he was like starving, and then he would do another one, and Dante was used to see him lounging around. So he meets, like in the Purgatorio, before he's got into the Purgatorio proper, in a place called Antipurgatory, just, you know, like an anti-chapel, not anti, but ante. He sees Belacqua like lounging around and like killing time and just hanging with the guys. And Dandy's going like, I do not believe it. And Belacqua's saying like, chill, man, you know, here's the deal. I'm on my way to salvation and I turned at the last minute and found Christ. But in order for me to understand what time is and how I wasted it, I am now obliged to waste as much time here as I wasted there, before I can get on to the good stuff and mount Purgatory and get up to back to paradise. Like, I have to know what Killing Time was about. It's killing me, man. You know, but he's just like such a music. It's just really cool. So Beckett's own alter ego, artistic alter ego in the stories is called Belacqua. But then later on, when Beckett's getting much more serious and dark, when he writes the trilogy Malloy, Malone Dies, L'Innommable, then the Unnameable, the final figure is like the figure of Satan. It's sitting, its tears are falling, it has no hands to cry its tears. And the last lines of that terrifying book are, I can't go on, I'll go on. And, you know, how do you read that? You know, is that the awfulness of hell, or is that the persistence of purgatory? So, you know, here's Beckett supposed to be an atheist, but he can't stop the conversation with Dante. And then, of course, Eliot starts the conversation with Dante in the wasteland when he's, you know, he's going, he sees the rush hour crowd in, you know, London and the unreal city under the brown fog. And he has this cool thing where he goes, so many, I had not thought death had undone so many. And he's comparing the commuters to the souls going round and round in limbo. And you think, like, he's like that classic person who only wants to read the Inferno. But when Eliot becomes a Christian, Dante suddenly becomes his supreme guide. And it's Dante who appears at the greatest of Eliot's Christian poems and quotes that very passage in the Purgatory. And then, I mean, we haven't got time to go into this, man, but, you know, Seamus Heaney, the transformative moment between the kind of hellish poems of the bog poems and the paradisal things of seeing things and electric light and, you know, the spirit level, the great triumphant poetry of his late period in the peace process and everything. In between that comes Station Island, which is his Purgatorio. And Station Island is a poetry sequence which is entirely rooted in Dante. There's a great book. Let me just grab it here. So if you want to know about this, there's a fabulous book edited by Peter Hawkins and Rachel Jackoff called The Poet's Dante, which specifically draws together essays by the great 20th century poets, including Heaney and Eliot, obviously, on Dante and what he means to them now. It's just superb.
That's great. As we run short on time, I want to
I
offer
guess we're coming to the end, you know.
a quick advertisement for next week. And also, I would ask you if you're willing to leave us with a poem in a moment.
Yeah. I think I'd like to do that because I don't want to leave you. Well, obviously, I didn't leave you in hell, but I don't even want to leave you in purgatory.
Yes.
So I think maybe I should give you one of the.
Well, let me show the book real quick. Here is the Singing Bowl, and for those, several people have asked online where the poems are from. They do come from this book of Malcolm's, and I would also advocate, since we are in Lent, his book of Lenten reflections, waiting on the Word in the Wilderness, in which there is a whole Dante section in here for week 3 of Lent. So just right in time, and those books are both signed by Malcolm. Next week at the same time, we will be hosting Malcolm again, another spell in the study, and we will have Jennifer Holberg from Calvin University, and we will have Rod Dreher. Rod's book, How Dante Can Save Your Life, is a very personal account of the poet. So we will be back here at the same time. Please do, if you like and follow the King Institute, you'll get all the details that you need. So Malcolm, I'll leave the last word with you.
I'm going to leave you with the final poem in my own Dante sequence, which is called The Rose. I realize actually, or at least as I've printed it out in the handout, you may not have the final lines of the poem, but you can hear them. I mean, they are on the thing. It's the one called The Rose. But maybe let's just, don't worry about putting the words up. Let's just hear it. So you may know that the final image, when Dante has the beatific vision, is he sees the whole cosmos as like the unfolding petals of a rose. And he sees all of us as like the petals facing inward to the kind of flower of the beautiful presence of the Holy Trinity. And the angels as being like the bees coming in and out of the rose. It's just a, you know, fantastic image. So I finish with this, and I was part of this poem is about Dante used the astronomy and physics of his day. And I partly thought, wow, Dante would have so loved he would have loved the singularity and the Big Bang and the 11 dimensions. And like, he would have done great things with that, you know. So here's my final poem, and this leaves us with the beatific vision and paradise. It's called The Rose. A white rose opens in a quiet arbor where I sit reading Dante. Paradise unfolding in me opens hour by hour in sunlight and amidst the hum of bees on a late afternoon. I think of how everything flowers. The whole universe itself is still unfolding, even now, sprung from a stem of singularity which petals time and space. I think of how the very elements that let my body be began and will continue in the stars, whose light and distance frame our mystery, and how my shadowed heart still loves, still bears with every beat that animates my being, eternal yearnings through the turning years. I turn back to the lines that light my seeing and lift me to the limits of all thought, and long that I might also find that freeing and enabling love, and so be caught and lifted into his renewing heaven. Evening glimmers and the stars come out. Venus is shining clear. My prayers are woven into a sounding song, a symphony as all creation gives back what is given in music made to praise the mystery who is both gift and giver. Something stirs a grace in me beyond my memory. I close the book and look up at the stars.
Thank you so much, Malcolm. We will look forward to seeing you again next week.
Thanks. Great to be with you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.